Maybe functional harmony is inherent in the laws of nature. This is an idea that goes back at least to Rameau. It's important for Schenkerian theory and for Riemannian theory, but not all music theorists agreed that music's based on natural law. Hermann Helmholtz, an important 19th century acoustician, wrote, "The principle of tonal relationship did not at all times exclusively determine the construction of the scale, and does not yet determine it exclusively in all nations. This principle must therefore be regarded to some extent as a freely selected principle of style." Helmholtz's argument reframed the old argument of nature versus nurture. What determines human behavior, inborn traits, or behaviors learned from other people? Helmholtz believed that music was primarily a cultural artifact, that it was primarily determined by nurture, but he never tested this idea on real people. We could test the influence of nature versus culture on music by analyzing music written by babies. When I was in graduate school, I took a class with Ira J. Hirsch, a psychologist who'd been doing experiments on babies. This is not as grotesque as it sounds. Hirsch simply played musical tones for the babies and observed their reactions. For example, he played the interval of a tritone and observed the baby's reaction to see if it cried. We used to joke at our university that there were many professors who made graduate students cry, but Hirsch was the only one upsetting the lives of babies. This experiment is not as silly as it sounds. Hirsch wanted to record natural human reactions to musical sounds. He used babies as subjects because he assumed that before they could talk, their reactions would not be contaminated by culture. I remember being skeptical and commenting that babies were bombarded with music even in the womb, and that the babies' reactions must be tainted by the reactions of their parents. Hirsch replied that babies were the least culturally conditioned subjects he could find. We're not going to find music written by babies, but we can find music written by people who didn't go to music school. Not only did these people not go to music school, but they believed that the theoretical knowledge of music was detrimental. This was the attitude of many rock and roll musicians in the 1960s and 70s. Rock guitarist Carlos Santana said, "I very rarely think of what chords, or what notes, or where I'm going to put my finger. I don't think musicians who can really play think of music like that. You cannot learn that in Harvard or Berkeley. That you have to learn from the streets. And that's my approach to music." Neil Young expressed a similar notion. It doesn't matter if you can play a scale. It doesn't matter if your technique is good. If you have feelings that you want to get out through music, that's what matters. The technical side of it is a complete boring drag as far as I'm concerned. Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits expressed it more bluntly. It's extremely foolish to have all these music schools create opportunities for talented kids on how to do technical things unbelievably well when they don't understand where the hell it's coming from. Rather than looking at music by a wide variety of rock and roll composers, I decided instead to do a kind of a corpus study of the most prominent rock group in the 1960s, the Beatles. I assigned songs from different periods of the Beatles' output to students in my analysis class. I asked them to supply Roman numerals where possible, and also to look at things like key, mode, and form. What the students found was that the Beatles used a very eccentric mix of techniques, some that came from common practice music, some that came from modal music, some from blues and country music, some that were unique to the Beatles themselves. Of the 20 songs analyzed by the students, only 3 had no modal content. These 3 songs were entirely in major keys. 10 of the songs included Mixolydian content, 3 included Lydian content, 3 had Dorian content, and 3 had Aeolian content. Some of the songs were variations on common forms of popular music. For example, Paperback Writer is based on a simplified blues progression, which consists of dominant 1 and dominant 4 chords. The melody's Mixolydian. Can't Buy Me Love consists of a verse, which is a 12-bar blues, with an added refrain. Many of the songs have very simple chord progressions. For example, Eleanor Rigby uses only major 6 and minor 1 chords, While basically a simple song, it has an elaborate accompaniment played by a string quartet. This accompaniment changes with each verse. There are also vocal harmonies and a smattering of imitation. Harmonically, the simplest song analyzed, Tomorrow Never Knows, is accompanied by a drone. It too has an elaborate accompaniment, which includes what appear to be sampled sounds, altered using tape manipulation techniques. Most of the songs have striking, somewhat unusual chord progressions. There is widespread use of major flat sevens and minor fives, although these can appear in the same songs as major fives and 5/7 chords. The Beatles didn't seem to follow any consistent formulas when constructing their chord progressions and cadences. Sometimes they used modal chord progressions, sometimes functional ones. Sometimes they use common progressions in uncommon ways. There's a kind of text painting with harmonic function in the song Penny Lane. The refrain of the tune modulates down a step, from B flat major to A flat major. To get back to the top, the song utilizes a 7 diminished and then a 5/7 in the original key at the end of the refrain. This is unusual because the transition to the 7 diminished is jolting. A D flat major chord in the key of A flat precedes the diminished 7 chord in the key of B flat. That's a D flat major chord to an A diminished. The text that starts on the diminished 7th chord is, "Meanwhile back." This reminds me of a cliche from old television shows. Commercials would play one after the other, and then suddenly a dramatic program would come back on the TV with the words, "Meanwhile back at the..." whatever. My point is that in Penny Lane, the harmonies illustrate this return to a different world, just as the words do. Perhaps the strangest chord progression examined was in the song Because. This song begins with an introduction that consists of a Neapolitan, followed by a 7 fully diminished 7 of 7. This leads into tonic at the start of the verse. This pattern reappears at the end. Because is supposed to be inspired by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The Beethoven has a prominent Neapolitan 6 in its introduction, so maybe that's why Because starts on a Neapolitan. But I can't find a prominent fully diminished 7 of 7 in the Beethoven. What I can find in the Beethoven is lots of prominent 3-note arpeggios in C sharp minor used as an accompaniment. This same pattern is found in Because, but with a twist. Rather than being in 12/8 like the Beethoven, Because is metered in 4/4. This means that the last arpeggiated group at each bar has only 2 notes, not 3. This makes the pattern a kind of lopsided Cuban trecilla rhythm rather than a continuous cycle of 3-note arpeggios. Maybe the most striking thing about the song is the fact that it doesn't end on tonic. It ends on a 5/7 of 7. Very strange. In summing up the general trends we found in the music of the Beatles, it's hard to get specific. Their music is often modal, much of it is mixolydian. Traditional major and minor modes are also found. Aspects of functional harmony can be found, but these functional chords are usually used along with modal cadences and chord progressions. Formulas common to popular music, like blues progressions, are also found, but they're usually used in an altered form. Strange, unusual patterns of chords are occasionally found. All told, this means that the Beatles' harmonic practice was extremely eclectic. This eclecticism might lead us to believe that the Beatles really were musical babies. They didn't go to music school, so maybe they didn't know how to build a proper chord progression. For example, it seems to me that their use of dominant 7th chords and secondary dominants to define tonic in songs with a fundamentally modal context shouldn't work. It should bother my ear, but it doesn't. Here's a little progression that I wrote to show you the kind of thing that they might do. I think the reason that these kinds of chord progressions work is that they do establish patterns, just not the kinds of patterns found in functional harmony. In fact, there is a kind of characteristic sound to many Beatles songs. This sound involves mixing modal progressions with a few common practice elements, like 5/7 chords. And while they're not systematic about how they combine these elements, they are consistent enough that their harmonic practice lends their music a certain characteristic sound. My students sometimes ask me if pop musicians know what they're doing, and the answer is yes, if what they mean by the question is, do they know how to do what they do? In the case of the Beatles knew how to be the Beatles. Or rather, they learned how to be the Beatles after many hours of practice and musical exploration. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, writes about the lives of extraordinary people. Amongst his conclusions is the idea that extraordinary people are made, not born. What I mean by this is that extraordinary people require hours and hours and hours of effort in order to become extraordinary. He cites the Beatles as an example. The Beatles were young and unknown when they broke into the pop music scene in Britain in the early 1960s. One might assume that their success was the result of talent alone. But one would assume wrong. Gladwell estimates that they put in some 2,160 hours perfecting their music in the clubs of Hamburg, Germany, before becoming famous in Britain. During those years in Germany, Gladwell claimed that they played 8 hours a day. That's way too many hours to fill up with original material. So the Beatles learned and played non-original songs, everything from rock and roll to folk to Broadway show tunes. So the Beatles learned to create their own music by performing an eclectic mix of music by other people, and by experimenting, by trying things out in live performance. The Beatles were hardly musical babies. They knew a lot about music, but they learned it by doing music, not by going to school. In my opinion, there's not that much difference between the way the Beatles became competent composers and the way that classically trained composers become competent composers. I've taught composition at the college level for 34 years, and I've not found any magic formula that produces wonderful compositions. All composers need to find their own paths, and they do this by listening to existing music, by performing it, by analyzing it. They also learn to compose just by doing it, and the more they compose, the more things they've tried that work for them. This vocabulary of things they've tried that work for them becomes their own style. My composition students often complain that they don't know what they're doing, and I reply that if they're doing it right, they don't know what they're doing, because they don't know how to write that particular new piece that they're working on. So they have to figure out how to do this new thing that they've never done before. It's a struggle, but they have no choice, because since this particular new thing has never been done before, nobody can teach them exactly how to do it. None of us know what we're doing until we actually figure it out. This brings us back to the idea that we started with. Is there something about music that makes it want to follow some kind of natural law? Many music theory teachers in the past would have replied yes, and systems like functional harmony were supposed to show how natural laws could be applied to music. It seems obvious to me that the Beatles weren't following any laws. They were just picking and choosing things and putting them together. But they weren't creating random assemblages. There were patterns to their melodies and harmonies. This indicates to me that music does not have to follow any particular kind of pattern, only that some kind of pattern is necessary in order to create musical coherence. While music theorists have always searched for universal patterns, it is perhaps the ones that are unique to each composer that are the most important and most interesting.